In MTG, an errata is a change to the rule text or type line on a card. Generally speaking, erratas are used in Magic to clarify a card's effect. These erratas don't change how the card functions, but instead makes the rules text easier to follow. However, there have been multiple times where a card was errata to specifically alter how its effect works. Some erratas have been severe enough that they completely change how the card functions. And today we're going to look at some of the biggest and most notable erratas in the game's history. Starting us off at number 10, we have Impulse. The card as it works today is an instant that costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana. You look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. The current effect is quite similar to the original card in Visions. The original effect did everything the current one did, but also shuffled your library at the end of it all. Original Impulse still let you put the 3 other cards you saw back in any order, but order wouldn't matter at all after you've shuffled your library. The card Ponder has a similar effect, although it puts the cards back on top of your library as opposed to the bottom. It also allows a player to put the cards back in any order and then shuffle anyways, but in the case of Ponder, the shuffle is optional. As such, the player has a choice of either keeping those cards and knowing the order they'll draw them, or leaving it up to chance. Meanwhile, with Impulse, not only was it not optional, meaning there wasn't any actual choice to make, the fact that cards were on the bottom of the library would have made the choice far less relevant in most scenarios of play. This is by far one of the most simple erratas on this list, yet it did fundamentally change how the card functioned. While the card is by no means significantly weaker now, there are instances where being able to shuffle the deck is relevant. The errata was mainly done for the sake of the card making sense, as well as saving time for players putting cards back in a specific order just to shuffle them away anyways. At its core, Impulse was playable before and after its errata, and the change itself did very little to affect that. However, the fact such a notable card, one that's been seen recent Standard and Pioneer play, has received a functional errata that most players aren't even aware of, is enough for it to earn at least the 10th spot on this list. Cards ahead of it generally had more substantial erratas, were errata'd for more present reasons, or even just received far more erratas. And at number 9, we have Mystic Denial. The card as it exists now is an instant that costs 1 generic and 2 blue mana that can counter a creature or sorcery spell. The effect is nothing too special, essentially just a much worse cancel. However, the card was initially printed as a sorcery, which meant it could not be played in response to any other spell. This essentially meant that, by the rules of the game, as they exist now, Mystic Denial was a spell that did not work. Notably, this card was not a mistake that slipped through the cracks and was intentionally printed as a sorcery. The card is from Portal Set, which was specifically an introduction set aimed at new players. The cards in the set were as simple as possible, to a point where some rules were tweaked and modified for the sake of streamlining things. As such, all non-permanent spells in the Portal Set were referred to as sorceries, and cards that could be played in response to cards specified so in their effect text. Given this quirk, when modernizing Mystic Denial's Oracle text, they simply changed the card types to properly be an instant. However, the card's effect did not get updated to account for instants, and as such, it can still only counter creatures and sorceries. Even if you could counter instant spells, the card would not be remotely playable. But this quirk of its design makes it even worse as a counterspell. Wizards of the Coast abandoned the Portal style of introductory set design fairly quickly, and the cards like Mystic Denial from it serve as a reminder of this strange deviation in design. If played as printed, Mystic Denial just simply does not work within the actual rules of the game, and only ever was meant to exist in weaker, less complicated versions of Magic that was short-lived in the long run. It's rare for a card to change its card type in an errata. However, for the case of Mystic Denial, it really was the only option for the card to function, given a sorcery cannot counter anything. As such, they made it into an instant so the spell would function, and now it remains as a minor oddity given its lack of proper reprint to reflect the change. And at number 8, we have Sylvan Library. The current version of this card is an enchantment that costs 1 generic and 1 green mana. At the beginning of the draw phase, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 of the cards you drew this turn. For each one of those cards, pay 4 life, or put that card back on top of your library. Essentially, how the card functions is that you're able to look at the top 3 cards of your library during the draw step. Pick which one to draw, then either put the other 2 back, or pay life to draw them. However, instead of the conventional route of just letting you look at the cards, it draws the cards first and foremost, then it has you put the cards back on top of the deck, which allows for interactions with the effects that double your card draw, or other ways of replacing those card draws for further advantage. This effect is also the source of much of the confusion with the card's templating and wording. The original version of the card in Legend specifically counted the damage as life loss as opposed to paying life like the modern version. Although minor at the surface level, this does have some relevant interactions and set precedents for the card's functionality changing. Of course, the card changed the most drastically with its printing in 5th edition, where its effect was retemplated entirely into an activated ability. This activated ability costs 0 mana, which would then draw 2 cards, then make you choose any 2 cards in your hand that you've drawn this turn, put them back on top of your library, unless you paid 4 life for each one. This ability was only allowed to be used during your draw phase and only once each turn. While the ability does functionally mostly capture what Sylvan Library does, it completely reshaped the card. In this iteration, anything that countered activated abilities would now be able to hit Sylvan Library. This was by no means a game-breaking change, but it further confused the actual effect as to what Sylvan Library was actually intended to do as a card. It didn't help that Sylvan Library itself was a very atypical card for the color green, one that's an overt break in the color pie of card design. Eventually, the somewhat archaic enchantment would receive its current Oracle text and eventually reprints, bringing it closer to the original text and intent of the card while also working better within Magic's rules. Comparing the Legends and current version of Sylvan Library aren't too different beyond some archaic wording, but when taking the 5th edition of the card into account, and its errata have really been all over the place in trying to nail down the identity of the card. And at number 7 on this list, we have Marath, Will of the Wild. This legendary creature as it currently exists in the game cost 1 red, 1 green, and 1 white mana for an elemental beast with 0 power and toughness. It enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. You may pay X generic mana and remove X counters of Marath, then choose to either put X +1/+1 counters on target creature, deal X damage to any target, or create a green elemental creature token where its power and toughness are both X. And you cannot choose 0 as the value for X, which is a rule that came with the card's emergency errata. Marath was one of the cards in the Commander 2013 product, designed to be played as the commander, and thus cost more mana as the game progressed thanks to the format's commander tax. However, without the errata to add X cannot be 0 clause, Marath would have been used for very different things. If X could be 0, then it would cost no mana at all to activate the ability. As such, you're free to activate it as many times as you wanted. This shouldn't have been too much of an issue since adding 0 counters or dealing 0 damage to something by itself doesn't do anything. However, beyond just having free activated ability activations, specifically the ability to make a token was what made Marath problematic. The token would have 0 power and 0 toughness, and thus would die just as soon as it entered the battlefield thanks to stat-based actions. While this means you can't amass an infinite army of tokens by itself, if you had a glorious Anthem style effect that boosted the token's toughness, then suddenly the tokens would survive and stick around to be a respawning army and it can't. But even without a way to make the tokens survive, Marath's original printed version had room to combo off, considering the tokens would still enter the battlefield and still leave the battlefield via dying to statted-based actions. This meant Marath offered infinite repeatable sources of enters and leaves battlefield triggers. Alongside something as simple as Impact Tremors, this could win games via pinging an opponent's life total down with each token's entry. Considering Marath was explicitly designed for play in the Commander format, where players would be able to begin the game with access to her, what was usually a 2-card combo could feel like a 1-card combo in terms of deck building and consistency. As such, Marath's Oracle text was updated to add the errata before players were able to even play with Marath legally. Later printings would have the errata text, but original printings of Marath lacked the line of text that holds the card back from being an accidental combo fodder. And at number 6 on this list, we have Island Fish Jasconius. This card costs 4 generic and 3 blue mana for a fish with 6 power and 8 toughness. Island Fish Jasconius doesn't untap during your untap step. However, during your upkeep, you're able to play 3 blue mana in order to untap it. Its other effects are some archaic limits on creatures' powers, limited to not being able to attack unless the defending player controls an island, as well as forcing the player to sacrifice Island Fish Jasconius if they don't control any islands themselves. The card's Arabian Nights printing lacked the clause that the card doesn't untap during the untap step, and said that you must pay 3 blue mana during the untap phase to untap Island Fish. This templating change is fairly minor, more so modernizing the idea of an alternative untapping condition and moving it to the upkeep step for game flow reasons. However, the more notable errata with Island Fish Jasconius was with its creature type. When initially printed, it was specifically an island fish. Island is not a valid creature type, but it is a basic land type, which led to confusions as to if Island Fish Jasconius is counted as a land. For one, if it was an island, then its own self-sacrifice clause would never naturally trigger, since it would count as the minimum 1 island required. More pressing than that would be the idea of fetch lands, however. There's only one creature in current Magic that has a basic land type, Dryad Arbor. This creature also doubles as a forest, which means any card which puts a forest into play can put Dryad Arbor into play. If Island Fish Jasconius counted as an island, then someone could sacrifice Polluted Delta for a surprise blocker with rather impressive stats. If the card worked this way, it'd be likely that Island Fish Jasconius saw actual play, since even with its downsides, a creature of its stats in exchange for a land is pretty worthwhile. Of course, this is purely hypothetical. For today's Island Fish Jasconius is only a fish and lacks the island type entirely. In its current iteration, there's really not much at all going for the card, and its only real use is as a novelty given its now removed typing. And at number 5, we have Camouflage. This spell costs 1 green mana and is an instant. Its effect with current Oracle text is that the spell can only be cast during the Declare Attacker's step. This turn, instead of declaring blockers, each defending player chooses a number of creatures they control and divides them into a number of piles equal to the number of attacking creatures for whom that player is the defending player. Creatures those players control that can block additional creatures may likewise be put into additional piles. Assign each pile to a different one of those attacking creatures at random. Each creature in a pile that can block the creature that the pile is assigned to does so. Piles can also be empty, and overall, this card is extremely convoluted in its current state. In fact, the card's original text is arguably easier to understand. Instead of dealing with piles, the original card simply turned all attacking creatures face down to conceal them from your opponent. Then the opponent would declare blocks, and once they'd finished doing so, all the creatures would be flipped back up. This original effect is more concise, and deals with potential ruling issues by simply having text that states any creature selected for a block that becomes impossible after attackers are flipped face up cannot block. This card was errata to its far more confusing version that emulates the randomness of attacking the face-down creatures by assigning piles, mostly because the game rules had changed around it. Face-down cards soon had more definition in the game of Magic the Gathering thanks to the morph mechanic. Morph as a mechanic casts a card face down to later then be flipped face up for its morph cost. With Morph established as a recurrent ability, Camouflage's original ability now conflicted with the more established mechanic. As such, Camouflage had to be errata to no longer flip cards face down, and as such, it had to change drastically in an attempt to find something workable within the current rules of the game. As a result, we're left with a rare errata that only serves to make a card more confusing and less easy to play, since this errata wasn't really able to take play ease into consideration. As such, this card originally printed in the very first set of the game now is completely unrecognizable and far less playable than it could have been with its original rules text. Not that the original Camouflage was a strong option, but it was fairly unique as far as combat tricks go. And at number 4, we have False Dawn. This sorcery costs 1 generic and 1 white mana, and its current effect as its errata is that, until the end of turn, your spells and abilities that would add colored mana instead add that much white mana. Also, until the end of your turn, you may spend white mana as though it were any color. The card also draws a card as its final effect. Much like Camouflage, False Dawn's errata came through trying to emulate the card's former effect, which did not work well with the rules. False Dawn originally changed the colored mana symbols on permanents you control and all cards you own that aren't in play into white mana symbols until the end of turn. Functionally, the errata does do the same thing in spirit as False Dawn was intended to do, which is allow you to use white mana for any color of spells and make all sources of colored mana generation white as well for the turn. The card's effect was updated because interaction with mana symbols was unintuitive, and a roundabout way of getting the card's intended effects of color manipulation. Years later, there would be a mechanic introduced in the Theros block called Devotion that specifically cared about the number of specific colored mana symbols on permanents you control. If False Dawn worked as originally printed, it would simply turn every colored mana symbol on your permanents into white mana symbols for the turn, meaning that your devotion to white would be quite high if you had enough permanents with mana symbols. This would in turn maximize the potential reward of any of your cards that cared about devotion to white. False Dawn's errata not only removed this potential direction, but solidified that colored mana symbol modulation isn't a part of card design as a proper mechanic. While cards can change their color identity, no cards have come since False Dawn and Apocalypse that so actively change mana symbol. The card was an outlier that was errata before the set even released, although not in time to prevent the original text from being printed. And at number 3, we have Oubliette. This enchantment costs 1 generic and 2 black mana, and unlike previous entries, it'd be easier to start with Oubliette's original effect. It was a rather unique effect, especially for the time, exiling a creature as long as Oubliette is on the battlefield and returning said creature to the battlefield tapped if Oubliette ever leaves. What made it unique beyond exile-based removal in black was that any counters or enchantments on the creature were tracked and exiled and remained on that creature. In fact, any auras on the creature targeted by Oubliette were also exiled until the Oubliette leaves the battlefield, yet will return already attached to their original target. This made Oubliette a unique and potent card in the Pauper format where it saw heavy play despite its relative obscurity in the card pool. Eventually, the card was finally reprinted to meet the demand of the format. However, its effect with more modern wording wouldn't have properly fit on a card, and would not have worked well with many mechanics added since Oubliette was printed. One significant issue was the card tracked counters and enchantments, but not equipments, mainly because Oubliette predated the equipment subtype entirely. As such, when it was reprinted in Double Masters, it received an errata to account for this, changing its ability from exile to phasing. Phasing out a permanent specifically treats a permanent as if it doesn't exist until it phases back in. The new version of Oubliette targets a creature and phases it and auras and equipments attached to it out until Oubliette leaves the battlefield. Whenever the creature phases back in, it even gets tapped to keep that part of the original effect. While not entirely the same, Oubliette does function fairly closely to its original version, maintaining both its playability and the general feeling of the original card. In fact, the card now is arguably stronger, given that it can now phase out a player's commander in the commander format. Exile-based removal, like original Oubliette, would allow the player to just put their commander back in the commander zone. However, phasing out doesn't change any zones. and as such the commander will stay phased out until Oubliette is gone. So now, what was once mostly just a pauper card, now has some use in the commander format thanks to its errata. And for the second spot on this list, we have All Hallows Eve. As of now, it is a sorcery spell that costs 2 generic and 2 black mana. You exile it with 2 scream counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if it's exiled with a scream counter, you remove 1 from it. If there are no scream counters on it, you put it into your graveyard, and each player returns all creature cards from the graveyard to the battlefield. This current effect is remarkably similar to the original printed version of the card. It functions as a delayed mass reanimation effect, something which is usually saddled with some form of drawback or restriction, as well as usually being symmetrical. This made All Hallows Eve somewhat unique for bringing back all the creatures, if after a few turns, and allowing your opponent to do the same. But at the time of its printing, its ability using counters in exile was an unexplored design space, and eventually the card was deemed to not work within Magic's rules. The card's Oracle text was changed to make the card an enchantment with a functionally identical effect, but staying on the battlefield instead of exiling itself. This, of course, made the card more susceptible to removal, since now that it was an enchantment, it could be destroyed before its effect brought your creatures back. Eventually, suspend spells and the time counter mechanic were introduced into the game. They functioned in a way similar enough to All Hallows Eve that they were able to revert the card back to mostly its original state. Now it is no longer an enchantment and a sorcery once again. Although instead of using time counters on it, it has its own unique scream counter. This makes sense, although it does disqualify the card from working with options that would work for spells with similar abilities. All Hallows Eve is one of the most errata'd cards of the game. Beyond some portal sorceries, it is one of the few cards to ever change card type throughout erratas, and is the only card to have changed its card type multiple times and going back to being a sorcery eventually. However, there is one card that has seen even more erratas, to a point where its changes eventually led to its final spot on the ban list in some formats. In comparison, while All Hallows Eve is unique and an interesting case of rules having to eventually catch up with their old rules, it is not nearly as impactful. And finally, the number 1 card with the most notable erratas in Magic the Gathering is Time Vault. This artifact costs 2 generic mana and enters the battlefield tapped and does not untap during your untap step. Its current effect, as of the most recent errata, allows you to skip your turn if you would begin a turn with Time Vault tapped, and if you do, untap Time Vault. Then, at any time you are free to tap Time Vault to take an extra turn after this one. While this is the Time Vault after multiple erratas, this current effect is not too dissimilar to the original effect. The original alpha version of Time Vault had the archaic typing a mono artifact, and was worded in a clunky manner, but functioned nearly identically to the current iteration of Time Vault. Back in the early days of Magic, players used the spell Twindle and other means of untapping Time Vault to get around its turn skipping restriction, and essentially take free extra turns whenever they found a Twindle type effect. In 1996, Time Vault received its first errata to specifically require a time counter to use its effect. This errata was entirely a power level one, making it so you had to tap the card and skip your turn the intended way to get the ability to get an extra turn as opposed to untapping it manually. If you used a Twindle on this iteration of Time Vault, it won't amount to anything because you lack the time counter needed to actually take the extra turn. They would tweak this version of the effect twice in 1998 and 2004. Both times were fairly minor adjustments. However, 2004 specifically reworded it so that it had to be an activated ability specifically to skip the next turn to untap Time Vault and put a time counter on it. This meant you can activate this several times to keep untapping Time Vault and adding more counters by skipping all those turns as well. This interaction was fairly useless until the card Flame Fusillade was printed and eventually turned this game-balancing nerf into a new game-breaking combo. Flame Fusillade gave all of your permanents the ability to tap and deal 1 damage to any target until the end of turn. Alongside Time Vault's 2004 version, one could keep tapping Time Vault to deal 1 damage and skipping the next turn to untap it. While they'd skip several turns, it wouldn't actually matter since your opponent would just lose the game before any of those turns. This interaction in the new Legacy deck that spawned because of it led to 2 more erratas in 2006 to attempt to end the combo, but still balanced Time Vault and only led to further confusion and woes. Eventually in 2008, Wizards of the Coast removed all their game balancing erratas altogether and simply errata the card one final time to be true to its original effect, but with modern templating. They also then promptly banned the card in Legacy and restricted it in Vintage, where it remains in both formats to this day. Time Vault was an experiment in balancing cards through errata that eventually, through failed experiments and player backlash, failed. Balance level erratas tended to be saved for only actively game-breaking situations, such as the companion situation in Ikoria, and the Time Vault serves as a reminder of when Wizards of the Coast attempted to fix the card, only to wind up breaking it all over again. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos similar to this one? If so, go ahead and leave it in a comment down below.